The Second World War was full of misunderstandings. The simplistic portrayal of it as a titanic struggle ending in the victory of democracy over dictatorship never bears examination.
앤터니 비버보다 2차 세계대전을 잘 아는 역사학자는 없을 겁니다. 도합 5,000페이지에 이르는 이 9권의 책에 앤터니 비버가 탐구한 2차 대전의 진실이 담겨 있죠. 전 세계의 전운이 감도는 지금, 히틀러라는 이름에 가려진 2차 세계대전의 불편한 진실을 마주할 시간입니다. 전 세계에 흩어져 있는 위대한 생각들을 모았습니다. 어떤 생각은 우리를 저 먼 곳으로 데려갑니다.
Welcome to EBS, Wiederhören Suap, Great Minds. My name is Antony Beevor, and I'm a historian of war and a writer. The Second World War was a war like no other, and yet it has come to define the very idea of war itself. The fighting stretched from the North Atlantic to the South Pacific, from the snowfields of Norway and Finland to the Libyan desert, from jungle fighting in Burma and on the islands and atolls of the Pacific Rim to SS-Einsatzgruppen in the borderlands and Gulag prisoners drafted into punishment battalions. For those involved in the fighting in one place, battles on the other side of the world could have been taking place on another planet. And when it came to the unspeakable cruelties of the Sino-Japanese War, they could have been taking place in the Dark Ages, when marauding hordes terrorized peaceful populations into submission with conspicuous cruelty. In the Second World War, the character of a leader determined the course of events. More than any other war in history, the vast struggle was dominated in the age of totalitarianism by major figures. This establishes even more firmly in the popular imagination the idea of the great man theory of history. The paradoxes in our attitudes to the subject of the Second World War are striking. The conflict brought world history together for the very first time, partly because of its global reach, but also because it accelerated the end of colonialism in Africa, the Middle East, and South and East Asia. And yet, despite its overwhelmingly international character, every country involved created and then tended to cling to its own national narrative of the conflict. Many cannot agree when the Second World War began. Each country has its own historical version of events because experiences and memories of it are so different. For Americans, the war started in December 1941 with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war on the United States a few days later. Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, insists that it began only in June 1941 when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. He angrily tries to whitewash Stalin's own invasion of Poland in September 1939 under the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Most Europeans assume that the Second World War commenced with Hitler's assault on Poland. Yet for the Chinese, it began in 1937 with the Sino-Japanese War, or even earlier with the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. And many on the left in Spain are still convinced that it began in 1936 with General Franco's nationalist rising to overthrow the Spanish Republic. Some say this so-called long war of the 20th century lasted from 1914 to 1945. Others prolonged the period until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. seeing it as an international civil war more than a conventional state-on-state war. A number of historians extend the conflict even further, arguing over what is called the Long War of the 20th century. German historians were the first to define the First World War as the original catastrophe. This is true. Yet it was the Russian Civil War, with its unbelievable cruelty, destruction and famine, which set the pattern for the whole century. Its unprecedented horrors created a polarizing fear between whites and reds, then communists and fascists, leading to the Spanish Civil War and then to the Second World War. What we tend to forget is that the Second World War was a combination of many different conflicts. These were conditioned by big power rivalry, but also by bitter ethnic disputes following the collapse of four empires and the redrawing of frontiers in the Versailles Conference, as well as those elements of an international civil war from that polarizing clash between fascism and communism. The simplistic portrayal of it as a titanic struggle ending in the victory of democracy over dictatorship never bears examination, especially with a totalitarian Soviet Union so predominant on the winning side. The Second World War was so vast and fragmented with all these different conflicts that one has to start somewhere if one is to form a reasonably cohesive and understandable pattern of the main military events. Rather than start with the Nazi invasion of Poland, as many would expect, I would begin a month earlier, in August 1939, when the Japanese army in Manchuria clashed with the Red Army on the Mongolian border at the river of Khalkhin-Gol. In comparison to the vast engagements which came later, this battle was comparatively small, but it influenced the whole course of the war. General Zhukov, in his first combat command, inflicted such a defeat on the Japanese that they decided not to attack north against Siberia, as many Japanese army commanders had wanted. Instead, the Imperial Japanese Navy would later prevail with its plan to attack south against British and Dutch possessions and American Pacific bases. It also meant that in the early winter of 1941, the Japanese refused to help when the Germans asked them to attack the Soviet Far East, to tie down Stalin's Siberian armies as the Wehrmacht advanced on Moscow. It is striking that Hitler had failed to recognize the very pertinent lessons of the Sino-Japanese War from 1937 before his own invasion of the Soviet Union 4 years later. He had no excuse for ignorance, since German generals had been advising Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist armies. The Chinese had soon learned that the only way to survive the onslaught of a more professional and better equipped army. The defender, if he has a large landmass to withdraw into, can deny victory to an invading army, however modern and well trained, because constant tactical withdrawals overextends the enemy's forces and makes him unable to control his rear areas. Also, the shock and awe of cruelty does not always stun an opponent into submission, as both the Japanese and the Nazis thought. It can also provoke him into desperate resistance. The anger and determination of the Soviet people was quite genuine after Hitler's brutal invasion in June 1941. Even the harshest discipline was accepted. When it came to ruthlessness, General Zhukov even exceeded his master, Stalin. On the 4th of October 1941, Zhukov, as commander of the Leningrad front, issued the following order: to make clear to all troops that all families of those who surrender to the enemy would be shot, and they themselves will be shot upon return from prison. Ironically, it did not occur to Zhukov when he issued this order that under it Stalin himself was in theory liable to execution, since his own son, Yakov Zhukashvili, had recently surrendered. I don't think that Stalin was unduly worried. He simply respected Zhukov for his pitiless determination. Although the war with Germany and the war with Japan were conducted as two separate conflicts, they influenced each other far more than may appear on the surface. The Nazi-Soviet Pact in August 1939, which had come as a great shock to Japan, had also affected its strategic thinking. This was not helped by the lack of liaison between Germany and Japan. Astonishingly, Japan concluded its neutrality pact with Stalin just 2 months before Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union. The Strike South faction in Tokyo prevailed, not just over those who wanted the war with the Soviet Union, but also against those in the Imperial Japanese Army who wanted to finish the war in China first. Because of their supremacist beliefs, Japanese militaries, like the Nazis, were compelled to confuse cause and effect. Perhaps predictably, they were enraged by President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill's Atlantic Charter, which they saw as an Anglo-American attempt to impose their version of democracy upon the world. They could well have denounced the hypocrisy of an imperial power such as the British Empire promoting democracy and self-determination. And yet their own notion of liberation with the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere produced a far more oppressive imperialism. The fact that their Asian New Order was strikingly similar to the German version, and their treatment of the Chinese ran parallel to the Nazi attitude towards Slav Untermenschen. Japan would never have dared to attack the United States if Hitler had not started the war in Europe and the Atlantic. A two-ocean war offered their only chance against the two naval powers of the United States and the British Empire. It was for this reason that Japan sought assurances from Nazi Germany in November 1941 that it would declare war on the United States as soon as they attacked Pearl Harbor. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, was no doubt still piqued that Japan had refused the German request in July to move against Vladivostok and Siberia. Ribbentrop was evasive at first. Roosevelt is a fanatic, he said, so it is impossible to foresee what he would do. General Oshima, the Japanese ambassador, then demanded bluntly what Germany would do. Should Japan become engaged in a war against the United States, Ribbentrop was forced to reply, Germany, of course, would join the war immediately. There is absolutely no possibility of Germany's entering into a separate peace with the United States under such circumstances. The Führer is determined on that point. Yet the Japanese still did not tell Berlin of their secret plan to attack American bases in the Pacific. So news of the attack on Pearl Harbor came, according to Goebbels, like a bolt from the blue. Hitler greeted the news with intense joy. The Japanese would keep the Americans occupied, he reasoned, and the war in the Pacific would surely reduce supplies sent to the Soviet Union and Britain. He calculated that the United States was in any case bound to enter the war against him in the near future, yet it would not be in a position to intervene in Europe until 1943 at the earliest. He, of course, knew nothing of the Germany First policy agreed between the American and British leaders and their chiefs of staff. On the 11th of December, the American chargé d'affaires in Berlin was summoned to the Wilhelmstrasse, where Ribbentrop read out the text of Nazi Germany's declaration of war on the United States. Later, in the afternoon, to the acclamations of Sieg Heil from party members in the Reichstag, Hitler himself declared that Germany and Italy were at war with America alongside Japan, in accordance with the Tripartite Pact. In reality, the Tripartite Pact was an alliance of mutual defense and had nothing to do with it. Germany was not in any way obliged to aid Japan if she were the aggressor. At a time when German troops were in retreat before Moscow, Hitler's declaration of war on the United States appears rash, to say the least. The decision reeked of hubristic pride, especially when Ribbentrop, probably echoing Hitler's own words, stated in a grandiose manner, "A great power doesn't let itself have war declared on it, it declares war itself." Yet Hitler had not even consulted the key military officers at Führer headquarters, such as General Adolfred Jodl and General Walter Werlimont. They were alarmed by the lack of calculation when they heard of his decision, especially since Hitler had insisted the previous summer that he did not want war with America until he had destroyed the Red Army. At a stroke, Hitler's earlier attempts to justify his strategy that a victory over the Soviet Union would eventually force Britain out of the war was now turned on its head. Germany really would face a war on two fronts. The generals were dismayed by his apparent ignorance of America's industrial might. Nazi leaders claimed that they were only good at making razor blades. Soldiers on the Eastern Front heard of the declaration of war and had no choice but to try to see it in an optimistic way. Ordinary Germans were shaken by the news. They started to fear that the conflict would now stretch on for years. It was later striking how many Germans convinced themselves by the end of the war that it had been the United States which had declared war on Germany, not the other way around. The key element in Hitler's thinking lay in the war at sea. President Roosevelt's increasingly aggressive shoot-on-sight policy, ordering US warships to attack German U-boats wherever they found them, and the decision to provide escorts to convoys west of Iceland, had begun to tilt the Battle of the Atlantic in the Allies' favour. Admiral Raeder had been pressing Hitler to allow his wolf packs to hit back. Hitler had shared his frustration, but until the Japanese Navy tied down the US Navy in the Pacific and agreed formally not to seek a separate peace with the United States, he had not dared make a move. Hitler's anti-Semitic obsessions had convinced him that the United States was basically a Nordic country dominated by Jewish warmongers. And this was another reason why a showdown between his new order in Europe and America was inevitable. Yet he failed to appreciate that the attack on Pearl Harbor had united America far more powerfully than Roosevelt could ever have hoped to do on his own.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The isolationist lobby, led by the slogan "America First," was utterly silenced. And now Hitler's declaration of war played straight into Roosevelt's hands. The president could not have counted on Congress to take his undeclared war in the Atlantic any further without it. As we will see later, this was the geopolitical turning point of the Second World War.